Okay, let's continue with these mini lectures over topics and principles of macroeconomics. So tonight I'm going to be giving a lecture on Say's Law, which is topic 26. And I guess you wouldn't know if it was night or day, but it is night, so I'm a little bit tired. Hopefully I still can do a good job of explaining what Say's Law is. But let's go to our course on Blackboard, courses, and here's our course, synonym 94-402, section 044. We'll open it up and we'll go to the lecture topics, and we'll open the lecture topics up in a new tab right here. And so 26 is Say's Law, Chapter 9. A, what is Say's Law? B, explain why the classical economists thought there was no inherent tendency in the market system to overproduction, recession, and depression. C, how did the classical economists explain recessions then, since they were obviously there? So the reason we want to get into this is not to go into great depth explaining what classical economics was about and how they explain the laws of motion of the economy, but we want to set it up as something that John Maynard Keynes is going to criticize back in the Great Depression, 1936. In the midst of it, he wrote the general theory of interest, money, and employment. So, and in it, he attacked Say's Law and the classical economist, his terms, and in contradistinction to them, he set up his own system. But his own system was set up based upon his criticisms of classical economics. So it would behoove us to take a look at classical economics so we can understand some of Keynes's criticisms, and those are going to come in question number 28, and also in 29. We'll see what he then proposed to get us out of the Great Depression. It'll sound very familiar to us today, since we are implementing many of the Keynesian policies right now to fight the recession that's going to be set off by the coronavirus shutdown. But after we get through that, we're then going to flesh out the theory that Keynes developed from these criticisms, and talking about the Keynesian consumption function, understanding what is meant by autonomous consumption, the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save. And we'll build a whole table based upon his ideas of what he thought people's consumption function would be. And then we'll take a look at a total expenditures, total production model, which is very similar to aggregate supply, aggregate demand. I'll explain the differences, but this is a type of model used for many years after Keynes wrote the general theory, really up until about 1980, when things began to change. And we will explain this really important thing that makes Keynesian policy work, if it's going to work, and that is the multiplier, the autonomous expenditures multiplier, how stimulating the economy can have a multiplicative effect on output. And really, I would suppose, and the textbook doesn't get into this too much, nor will I get into it, if there's little or no multiplier effect, then really we wonder about the overall long-run effect of Keynesian policies. But that's where we're headed right now, and we're not going to get there all the way before we have the second test. I'm hoping to have the second test right after topic 28. So we're on topic 26. We need to go through 26, 27, 28, maybe 29 before the second test. And I have to do that today and tomorrow, hopefully. We'll see if I can do it. All right, let's go to the PowerPoint. And so I have all of my lecture recordings and the PowerPoints are connected to, listed under simply enough PowerPoints right here. This is question or topic 26. You can see the lecture topics I've done before. I have them right below the question topics we've covered. I've done quite a few already. And here we are in 26. We might save this free market versus interventionist, Hayek versus Keynes, fun little rap video for right before we get to Keynes's criticisms of the classical economist. So let's open up this PowerPoint, which I already have opened up right here. And let's get busy talking about this topic. So first of all, we need to define Say's law. And simply, really very simply, and maybe I should do like a red here so that it's really emphasized. Say's law is just that supply creates its own demand. So if business firms produce goods for sale, in producing them, they're creating the demand for them. And I suppose, I'm sort of letting the cat out of the bag here, but certainly later, once we take a look at Keynes, we could say that just like Marx said he stood Hegel on his head, Keynes stood the classical economist on his head, because what he really is going to say is that demand creates its own demand, its own supply. So he's just going to stand it on its head. Anyway, I suppose it's like the chicken and the egg problem, really. But let's take a look at what the argument is here. So production creates demand sufficient to purchase all goods and services. Say's law implies that there cannot be either number one, a general overproduction of goods, where supply in the economy is greater than demand. And of course, this would result in a recession if it were true, okay? Or a general underproduction of goods. And of course, this would result in inflation. All right. And so the classical economists are saying that markets in themselves, I suppose, cannot create either of these things by themselves. They don't deny that they occur. They just say they're not inherent in markets. So, taking a slightly different tack than the textbook, let's actually say what John Baptiste said about supply creates its own demand. And actually, it's a little bit different than Keynes implied, but and actually he was dealing with exchange without money. In other words, it was a barter economy. There was no money. Instead of money intermediating intermediating the exchange of goods. Like you bring your good to market, you sell it for money, and then you take the money and buy the good that you want. That's really the role of money, is to facilitate exchange and make it easy. But barter is just the direct exchange of goods. So the person who brings commodity A to the market has to find someone else who not only wants what he has produced, but has what this person wants. So you need a double coincidence of wants. And that's one of the prime reasons why money always develops. But with barter, and here's the basic thing of Say's law right here, a person brings his goods, commodity A, to market for exchange for other goods. Let's call them commodity B. Okay, by necessity, by the very logic of what's going on here in this little model without money, a person brings to market, what he brings to market must always equal his demand for other goods. In other words, let's say you have a cobbler bringing sandals to market. He's produced 100 of them. He's throwing them into his little two-wheeled cart and is off to market, pulling it by himself. And those sandals in his cart represent the supply of sandals in the market, obviously, but they also represent the demand for other goods. So just by the logic of this situation, demand and supply are always equal. The supply of goods always equals the demand for goods, okay? This is the original meaning of Say's law. So let's get into what Keynes now meant. So if you introduce money, things get more difficult because money can leak out of the circulation process. I mean, once you sell your goods for money, what if you take it and bury it in a chest in your barn? Well, then it's not buying other goods. And obviously, the demand for other goods won't equal the supply that's been brought to market. So we're going to say that, I feel like I got a little bit further ahead of myself, that Say's law really means all markets tend to equilibrium. So instead of burying it in their backyard, people might save it, like in a saving institution, or you give it to someone for investment purposes. So we have credit markets, and so the financial institutions or people, helping people with their savings, will then try to find places to invest it or lend it out. And so once it's lent out or invested, it's back in circulation. So this market, this finance investment market, balances the leakages with injections that come from it. All right. So Say's law does not mean that all markets are always in equilibrium all the time, of course. It's possible that some markets, the markets in sandals versus the markets in gasoline versus the markets in horseshoes, they could all be in different states of equilibrium. You might have some where the supply is greater than demand. People aren't really buying as much, or shortages where the demand for the goods is greater than the supply. And likely both of these are going on at the same time. For example, if consumers' tastes change and they now want more of X and less of Y, the price of X will rise because the demand is going up there. And the price of Y will fall because people are spending less there. All right? And so in one market, prices are relatively rising, and the other market, they're relatively falling. If this change in taste is permanent, some producers and resources will migrate from producing Y to producing X because, they're not making money producing Y anymore. and it looks like the people producing X are making good money. This will continue to happen until all of the above normal profits are squeezed out of producing X. In other words, as people go into producing X, the supply increases, the price falls. And as people leave producing Y, the number of people producing Y decreases, the supply of Y decreases, and prices rise back to normal levels. At this point, prices of both goods will have returned to where they were before, but there's been a big change. While prices have basically returned to their previous levels, resources will have been reallocated where they are most highly valued without government intervention, based upon self-interest of all actors in our economic drama. And this, my friend, is the really big conclusion of classical economics, and what sets them in really great political conflict with the interventionists is that they think all of this can be done without government intervention. Indeed, the government shouldn't intervene at all. It should let the market reach its equilibrium naturally. So this is the heart of the meaning of Say's law. I know it's not there in the textbook, but I thought I would go off on it a little bit more. And so the conclusion, and let's go back to that other one. I might have made a bad order here. I think that would be better, don't you? I think if we pull this down here, it goes more naturally there. So in other words, this is the heart of Say's law. And so we can say, with exchange of money, of course, with the interpretation of Say's law is easier. I'll have to think about where to put this slide. But I think this is a better way to interpret Say's law. Markets always tend to equilibrium. All right? And as we'll see in a moment, this means, and maybe I'll write this here. Oops, I want something a little bit more. Okay. This means all prices wages and interest rates are flexible both upward and downward. And basically the textbook goes into great detail. All prices are flexible. They're saying that's what the classical economists believe. Really what all that means is that all markets tend to equilibrium. That's the same thing. All right. So let's see what the textbook has to say about this. A little bit more. For our purposes of macroeconomics, what Say's law means is that there cannot be a situation where the amount supplied in all markets is greater than the amount demanded. Aggregate supply is greater than aggregate demand. In other words, the market system cannot cause recessions. There is the big thing. The market system itself cannot cause recessions. Recessions are not caused by the market system. There's the word I was looking for. In other words, recessions are not endogenous to the system. All right. And once we get to down the page a little bit, we'll get to the opposite of endogenous. Genus is generated, and endo means inside. They're not generated inside, okay? And exogenous means they are generated outside, okay? And this is what the classical economists believed. We'll get to that in a moment. You know, it might be nice to add a little circular flow here. Let's go back to the home. Let's add a new slide here. What do you say? There you go. And basically, let's go to draw. Let's get our black pen here. And let's just do a very simple circular flow. So I know I can't draw that right here. Maybe I'll get better in a few years. So we have the households here, and down here we have the business firms. And I hope everyone is by now familiar with my use of this. And we have markets intermediating households where consumers live and reproduce, and households where production of goods and services happens. And the markets, there are three markets in general, and they are the final goods and services market and the factor market, and that's a factor of production like labor, capital, raw materials, land. Households own the factors of production and sell them to business firms, and we'll just say this is the money market, all right? And basically what we have is business firms produce goods and services, and they send them to this market, and this is the aggregate supply. In producing the aggregate supply, of course, let's just see if, is this green? No, let's get a nice green one here somewhere. All right. Money goes up here. You know, these are cost of production, wages, salaries, rent, interest, and profit. And these go to households as income. And so production here generates just enough income to buy everything over here, okay? Now, something bad might happen. Who knows? Something very bad might happen. And that's what the textbook talks about. And we can go to red. Instead of spending all the money, some of it actually leaks out here into the money market, okay? There is saving. Now all this money can't buy everything that's produced. But the money market rides in, the supply and demand in the money market, flexible interest rates, and business firms, here we're simplifying, households could borrow too, they, of course, borrow, and then from what they borrowed, they send up here to join. So here's consumption, and here's investment. So consumption and investment come together and buy everything that's been produced. And basically, that's your circular flow sort of description, if you will, of Say's law. Let's see what the textbook has to say. So here it is. So if consumption drops and saving rises, economic forces are at work producing an equal increase in investment. And so you have a certain income, disposable income, and you split it between consumption and savings. And let's just say, for example, that you have $100 of income and you're spending $90 and you're saving $10. Now you think, oh my God, I better stop partying. I'm getting older. I better save some more and consume less on parties. So now you only spend $80 per period and you put another $10 aside. So notice that this increase in savings causes consumption to go down with income constant, okay? So that's basically what's happening here. And by the way, y sub d is what? Disposable income, all right? And so now what happens is that increase in savings we talked about before increases the amount of loanable funds, savings available. So this supply of savings is saving, and it increases at every interest rate. And so at the old interest rate, the amount of amount of loanable funds saved is greater than the amount demanded. And so the financial intermediaries, the banks, the people taking care of people's money, they'll say, gosh, if you borrow from us, we'll reduce the interest rate. But as the interest rate is reduced, people save less, but other people want to borrow more. And so just like in chapter 3, as long as there's a surplus of money here, the interest rates come down and the amount people want to borrow goes up. And so in the end, we do reach a new equilibrium right here where we have increased the amount people are borrowing. So the increase in saving exactly equals the increase in borrowing in the end. So before, you know, all of the additional saving has been borrowed as the interest rate drops. And so the markets clear this. So saving money was not going to cause a problem, wasn't going to cause aggregate demand to be greater than aggregate supply, according to the classical economists. And this is the last one. So they say, okay, oh, by the way, here we get into total expenditures. And I know we haven't spoken of this, and it's introduced here. Basically, total expenditure, you can see, is very similar to aggregate demand in that they're equal to consumption, investment, plus government spending, plus net exports. But total aggregate demand allows price level to change, and total expenditure does not. Price level is fixed. All right. So, and that's a big thing about Keynesian economics. It assumes that price levels are fixed. In other words, gosh, I guess the big difference is going to come. You might say, why not aggregate demand? But if you have real GDP here and price level here, this is short-run aggregate supply, as we were seeing. But in the Keynesian model, this is the Keynes, if you will, aggregate supply. Price level is constant. PLC, okay. But here in the classical model, so using this Keynesian model for classical purposes, you have $5,000 in income, you spend $3,000 on consumption, $600 for investment, $1,200 on government spending, plus $200 in net exports. Then, of course, you increase savings by 100, and you can see it goes from 600 to 700, but the commiserate change is that consumption falls. The ultimate amount of total expenditure remains the same, and indeed investment increases because of the equilibrium of the financial markets. And that pretty much does a Keynesian, I guess, view of classical economics. So let's see what we have here. So here's a textbook conclusion. prices and wages, both flexible, and we might as well put interest rates too, right? And real inflation adjusted. That's what real means. I'll just repeat that. Because wages and prices are inflation adjusted too. Interest rates. So interest rates, prices, and wages are all flexible up and down. Basically what we said before, they're just saying the markets all come to equilibrium. All right? Markets are competitive, supply and demand operate in all markets. In other words, they all come to equilibrium. I don't know why they beat it around the bush with that. Basically, all markets tend to equilibrium. I'm not sure why they don't use that phrase. Maybe because saying they don't would make people think, really? Should we take this theory seriously? So if the labor market has a surplus, the surplus will be temporary, wage rate will decline, and quantity supplied of labor will equal the quantity demanded of it. And given a shortage in the labor market, the wage rate will rise, and it'll come to equilibrium. So what holds for wages holds for prices in all goods and services market. All markets come to equilibrium. So now we get to part C here for 26. How can recessions be explained by classical economists then, if they deny that they rise from inside an imbalance of supply and demand? So according to classical economists, shocks from outside the market system cause business cycles. Gosh, here I used to say the best example of such a postulated cause, and I mean hypothetical cause, was, I guess it was Anthony Edgeworth and Stanley Jevons, who hypothesized that cycles and sunspot activity cause business cycles based upon their impact on the weather and hence on agricultural production. We don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I've been talking about the sunspot theory for decades. And of course, goodness, what about global warming? Well, these economists from the 1800s were already talking about this, except global warming was good. It meant that the agricultural sector could really produce a lot of food and raw materials that reduced their price. People had extra income to buy manufactured goods and stimulated that. But then when the sunspot activity ceased and the weather got much colder, then it was much more difficult to grow agricultural products and raw materials, and their supply was reduced, their real prices increased, people had to spend more of their income feeding themselves, and they had less money left over to buy manufactured goods, and we were into a recession. So that was obviously an interesting explanation for the business cycle 150 years ago, is that the sunspot activity caused business cycles. But as far as exogenous shocks go, we've got one going right now with the coronavirus and the stay-at-home orders, which of course is greatly reducing what we'll say is aggregate supply. So this would be the very thing example, if you will, of a classical explanation for a business cycle, what we're going through right now. So, all right, I guess I should say a little bit more about sunset cycles. I'm not sure these links still work, but one reason that economists thought that the two were related is that from peak to peak, the business cycle in England in the 1700s and 1800s was about 11 years long. And wouldn't you know, so was the sunspot cycle. Now, this has been studied by a huge amount over the last 150 years, and no correlation has ever been established. There seems to be a correlation of zero between peaks in the business cycle and peaks in the sunset cycle and troughs in each. They seem to be completely out of phase, so no one believes this is true anymore. So who knows? Over here, we might say, oh, let's do draw again. Let's do here. But we should always reserve a little part of doubt. Maybe it will come true, hey? Gosh, way back in the Stone Age, I'm kidding, way back when I was a college student, I took geology courses, and I took one at the University of Texas from a world-famous volcanist. In other words, he studied volcanoes. And in that class, we discussed an idea, and he was cautious about criticizing it, about a geologist who thought that the continents floated together and apart from one another. And he said most geologists thought this was completely crazy. How could continents float? They were firmly linked into the ground below them. What were they floating on? And of course, within 15 to 20 years, all of that was revolutionized with plate tectonics. And now the crazy people are thought to be the people that the continents don't move. So I would just say be careful, keep an open mind. Maybe. I don't believe the sunset cycle, but it's fun to speculate about. So let's talk about other exogenous things. So really, I should have put, natural things in addition to sunspots. I guess pandemics would be one, sunspots and pandemics. But really, the classical economists thought government actions were the main cause. And of course, classical economists were classical liberals. And liberal meant much different thing than it does today. But back then it meant basically a great suspicion of government. And basically you could say the least government I'm going to is the best government, or governments are the source of almost all evil. So they wanted to see very small governments. Left-wingers, socialists, progressives, etc. today now call this position neoliberalism. But I guess I call it neo because I think it's different than the sort of progressive interventionist socialist liberalism that Americans thought was liberalism from about 1930 to even today, I suppose, even though you don't hear it used so much anymore. But the big thing we do want to say about this is that the thing they really thought caused business cycles was the government messing with credit availability, creating money, or shrinking the money supply based upon mistakes or their domestic policy or their fights with other countries, that this changes in the money supply, credit availability, as caused by government, was the main source of business cycles. And once we get out of the Keynesian thing, we'll come to what I call neo-Keynesians, but it's sort of like this neoliberal, I suppose. Monetarists, starting in the 60s and 70s, they did explain the Great Depression as this very thing here, that it was caused by the government manipulation of the money supply. So it comes full cycle, and maybe we're turning the wheel once again. I don't know. We'll have to see what the result of this coronavirus recession is. All right. Well, that is topic number 26, and we'll be going on to 27 soon, okay?